Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. In this lecture we're going to learn about multidimensional arrays. Okay, so in the basic section we already learned about arrays. This is how we can store multiple pieces of data in just one variable. We've got essentially multiple containers at each different index. So now we can just go one step further and essentially make multiple dimensions of these arrays. For example, we can make it have 2 dimensions, so it has 2 axes. And then each position, instead of having just 1 coordinate, it actually has 2. So for example, on this array, we can go into position 0, 0 and place some kind of number. Or we can go into position 2, 3 and place some kind of number. Go into 4, 1 and draw something, and so on. So each of these positions works exactly the same as the elements in a regular array. They can be set or you can get their value. And this is an example of a 2D array. So you've got a certain axis and another axis. But you can have as many dimensions as you want. You can have a 3D array, 4D array, 5D, 6D, or literally anything you want. However, this is also just one type of multidimensional array. There are multiple types and multiple ways to build them. So this is the syntax for building a regular one-dimensional array. So int, then the square brackets, int array, then create an array with some kind of size. And one way to make a multidimensional array is to make an array with multiple dimensions. So to do that, here when we define an array, we include a comma for the dimensions. So in this case, we have 2 dimensions, so one on the left side, one on the right side. Technically, there's no limit, so you can add as many dimensions as you want. So here, let's do a simple 2D array. So we do that, and then afterwards, we just include the size for both dimensions. And yep, like this, we have a 2-dimensional array. On the first dimension, it has a size of 5, and on the second one, it has a size of 6. This creates the array, and then in order to modify a certain index, we can just access it with the coordinates. So go inside the int array, and now on a flat array, you would just put an index, but this one is multidimensional, has 2 dimensions, so we need to put the index for both dimensions. So for example, 0, 2, and yep, this will access the element inside the array on position 0, 2. You can use this to read the value or assign it to something else. Then when it comes to arrays, you will eventually want to cycle through them. And normally you would do some kind of for, so for int I equals 0, I less than the int array.length, do this plus plus. So normally this is how you would cycle through an array. However, now with a 2-dimensional array, if we do this, then this one, this int array.length, this one is going to return the total length. So in this case, it is going to return essentially 5 times 6. So we can do a console.writeLine to see. So the int array.length, and if there it is, the result is indeed 30, which is 5 times 6. So that's the total size of the array. When we have a multidimensional array, in order to get the length of a single dimension, for that we can access the function getLength. This one, as you can see, takes a parameter for the dimension. So let's first cycle through all the elements in the first dimension, and then inside we can do another for loop. By the way, I'm going to cover nested loops in detail in the next lecture. But yep, just like this is going to cycle through every element in the entire array. It will cycle through the first dimension, then the second dimension in order to go through every single element. We can do a console.writeLine and print out the int array on position I and j. This will print out the value stored in that coordinate. Let's also just print out the I, then comma, then the j, then something, so we can see what we're seeing. Okay, let's see. And if there it is, we can see it all working. So first checks position 0, 0, then 0, 1, 0, 2, and so on, until it gets to 1, 0, so on and so on. And all the values are just 0 because we just initialized all with 0. But as you can see, this is indeed cycling through the entire array, through both dimensions of our multidimensional array. Alternatively, for initializing the array contents, we can do this. Note the difference between this syntax and the syntax with just one dimension. So here we have some curly braces, and then inside we have multiple pieces of curly braces, one for each of the second dimension of the actual array. And up here we can see the array being initialized. So in 0, 0 has 1, 2, 3, then on 1, 0 it has like that. One crucial important thing about these kinds of arrays and initializing it like this, the shape needs to match. So on the first one, if we initialize this with 4 elements, then the second one also needs to have 4 elements. In order to have multidimensional arrays with differently sized elements, for that we can use jagged arrays, which I'm going to cover in a little bit. But before we get to that, like I said, there are multiple ways of doing multidimensional arrays. This is just one way where you have a single array with multiple dimensions, and the other common alternative is simply to have an array of arrays. So instead of int and square brackets and having a common, we have int and then square brackets, open, close, and then open and close again. This is basically creating a new array of arrays. Then we can do the usual cycle through it. So for int I equals 0, less than array.length. Here we can use length because again, this is not a multidimensional array. It is an array of arrays, meaning it's an array, and inside each position, each element itself is going to be an array of multiple elements. So we can do this, I++, and we can go int array on this index, and inside it, we create a new int array of whatever length we want, like for example 6. So basically what we have here is what we had previously when we had a multidimensional array with 5 and then 6 on the other dimension. And then for accessing this one, we access it by int array, then access the first dimension, like say on position 0, and then the second dimension, let's say on position 2. So yep, this is how you set or read some elements from an array of arrays. So this is also a valid way of storing multiple dimensions. Instead of having just one array with multiple dimensions, you have multiple arrays of arrays. And of course, the same thing that I said a while ago about having no limit to how many dimensions you can have, that still applies here. So you can have as many arrays of arrays as you want. So this code looks pretty insane, but yep, this is perfectly valid code. One crucial difference about these two types is basically the defaults that they will use. For example, down here, when we create an int array with multiple dimensions, when we do this, by default, all the elements inside of this array won't be on 0. So yep, like we see, all the elements default to 0. Whereas on this one, since this is an array of arrays, if we just cycle through the main array, if we try to access this one, so let's do a console.writeLine on this one. So let's print out the array on this index. Let's do that and see what this prints out to see basically what each element of this array defaults to. And if there it is, the answer is essentially null. We can compare this equals null. And if there it is true, so all of these elements are set to null. So that is one big difference between array of arrays and multidimensional arrays. These get initialized with every value at 0 on whatever type you're using for the array. Whereas this one, since each element inside of the main array, since each of those is actually an object, it's actually an array of something else. Because of that, by default, the default value for some kind of array is going to be null because arrays are reference types as opposed to value types. Which, by the way, I cover value and reference types, what those are. I cover those in detail in a future video. And then another difference between these two types. One thing that you can have with array of arrays, but you cannot have with a multidimensional array, one of those things is what is called a jagged array, meaning each subarray can have a different size. Down here, when we define this multidimensional array, by default, the shape of this array of multiple dimensions, the shape will pretty much be a rectangular size. So over here, 5 in one dimension and 6 on another one. It will always have some kind of rectangular shape. However, in an array of arrays, that does not have to be the case. For example, when initializing this, we can set the one on index 0 to be a new int array, and let's say this one has a size of 3. Then on the next one, on element index 1, we can say this one has a size of 6. Then on index 2, we can say this one has 10, and so on. So using an array of arrays, technically each array inside the main array, each of those can have whatever size you want. As for what use case this would have, for example, imagine some kind of grid for a theater. When you go to the movies and select a seat, usually different rows have different number of seats. So that's an example where this kind of data structure could be useful. You would have maybe 3 seats on the first row, then 6 on the second one, and so on. So that could work. It does have some use cases. Although personally, I pretty much never use them, since in games, usually things have some kind of rectangular shape. Things like an inventory or a world, usually those have some kind of rectangular shape as opposed to some weird jagged shape. Now, when working with multidimensional arrays, we need to cycle through them just like we saw. So let's learn about nested loops in detail in the next lecture.